Hello, hello, it's Miss Winky, and today we are going to go over the last section of notes for Unit 8. So the war's over. It ended in Notes 2, in case you haven't been keeping up. It ended in Notes 2, and today we're going to talk about what things were like in Georgia immediately after World War II. Okay, so one thing that happens is there's more of a shift from rural areas to urban areas. This kind of starts to some degree, like from Unit 7 that it already started because of the Great Depression. It continues both during World War II and after World War II. During the war, it's because people start moving to the city to get jobs in factories and other plants that were producing stuff for the military. So, like, people move into the city to go work for the Bell Aircraft Company, for Bell Bomber, and people moving to Savannah and Brunswick to work for the shipyards. So, that was already happening. And then after World War II, that continued. Here are some of the reasons why that continues even when the war is over. There was a drop in cotton production, which you guys remember from Unit 7. The reasons that cotton production dropped and continued to drop was, the boll weevil was still a thing. Remember, the boll weevil, doesn't go away until like 1987. There were also still limits on crop production from the AAA that had been put into place during the Great Depression. So that caused cotton production to drop. And after World War II, there was actually a decrease in demand for cotton. Mainly because of new fabrics that had been introduced, like synthetic fabrics that didn't require cotton fibers. Um, those new fabrics had been introduced, like polyester and rayon, and people started buying things made out of those fabrics instead of things that were made out of cotton. Um, Another reason why the population continues to shift from rural to urban areas is because there are technological advances in agriculture. And because of these new technologies, they don't need as many farm workers. Examples of that would be inventions like tractors and mechanical reapers that were now being used on farms. And that meant that they didn't need as many farm workers to do that work. And they had better food fertilizer that boosts crop growth, meaning you don't need workers to continually work on doing that for you because you've got fertilizers that are doing it instead. All right, so like I just mentioned, there were new fabrics like polyester and rayon that had been invented for the war that decreased the demand for cotton. And so instead of cotton, people started growing crops like peanuts and corn and soybeans. So lots of new row crops, which is a term used to describe crops that are grown in rows. Lots of new row crops were being grown in Georgia instead. And you probably remember reading this article on the Unit 7 test. Poultry ends up becoming a big source of income for farmers in Georgia, especially up in North Georgia, which is where we live, because the hills there really weren't well suited for cotton and for the new types of mechanical inventions that were being used for farming. Those things didn't work very well in the hills in North Georgia. So a lot of the farmers switched over to producing poultry instead. Okay, Georgia's growth. We're going to start talking about a lot of people now. We talked about all the dictators from World War II and about the leaders of the Allied powers from World War II, and then we also talked about our members of Congress. We talked about Carl Vinson and Richard B. Russell, but today we're going to talk about all the rest of the people that are on your vocab list. So one of the biggest businesses in the state of Georgia following the war is aviation, manufacturing airplanes and airplane parts. You remember that the Bell Aircraft plant closed after the war, but then it was bought in 1951 by Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin starts operating out of that same plant. And by the end of the 50s, they are the biggest employer in the state of Georgia. And fun fact, they're still one of the biggest employers in the state of Georgia. So Lockheed Martin is still manufacturing airplanes and plane parts in our state, and it's big business, does a lot for our economy. Uh, Cars. also become a really big deal after the war. Because, like, during the war, car companies had been making trucks and tanks and Jeeps that were being used for the war. But after World War II, they switched back over to making passenger cars. And this begins a period known as the age of the automobile, when everybody starts buying cars. So the US government had already been planning a system of interstate highways back in the 1930s. And the two reasons that they wanted this were to encourage economic growth and development, so making it easier for people to trade between states and to ship their goods back and forth between states, and also because they thought it would improve the defense of our nation, that those same highways could be used to move military personnel and military equipment if we were attacked, that it would make it easier to defend our country. So in 1956, after World War II, President Eisenhower, because remember, Eisenhower is president at this point, he appoints a World War II era General Lucius D. Clay. He appoints him to design this system. And can we all just take a second and talk about how glorious that first name is? Lucius? Come on, man. That's a great first name right there. So Eisenhower appoints him to design the interstate highway system. So, fun fact, Lucius was actually from Marietta, Georgia. He was from Georgia. He was a Georgia native. So when he was making these plans for the interstate highway system, he made sure that three interstates ran through the city of Atlanta. See, sometimes when you've got people from your state who are in these kinds of positions, they make an effort to do things that will benefit their home state. So having Lucius Clay, General Lucius D. Clay, designing that system benefited the state of Georgia because he made sure that three of those interstates ran through Atlanta. So I-20, Interstate 20 goes through Atlanta, Interstate 75 goes through Atlanta, and Interstate 85. All three of those go through the city of Atlanta. And this, combined with some other things that we're going to talk about in a later unit, make Atlanta the transportation hub of the Southeast. Like, from Atlanta, you can get anywhere on the interstate highways and using the other transportation systems. And again, we're going to talk more about that in a later unit. Okay, so in terms of interstate highways, we have 1,244 miles of interstate highway that pass through the state of Georgia. And they're important to our economy because they connect us to the rest of the nation. They make interstate travel really easy. They make it easier to transport goods to other US cities and manufacturing centers. So easier for us to ship goods back and forth using the highways. I'm willing to bet that you guys have parents that have used those highways to commute to and from work. And they're also credited with bringing lots of businesses to Atlanta, major national and international corporations to the city, because if they can produce their goods here, they can get them on the interstate highways and get them out wherever they need to go. All right. Other than the three interstates that pass through Atlanta, the other two major interstate highways that go through Georgia, one of them is I-95. This is the coastal highway. It actually connects Florida with Maine. So you can go all the way from Maine, all the way down the east coast of the United States and end up in Florida. Okay, so it goes through our coastal areas and it runs through 16 states from Florida to Maine. That's I-95. The other major interstate highway that passes through Georgia is I-75. It crosses us from the northwest corner of the state and then goes all the way down to our border with Florida. And it connects Florida with Michigan. Okay. So from the previous slide, we've got I-20, I-75, and I-85 that go through Atlanta. And then in addition to those highways, we also have I-95 from the previous slide. Okay, let's talk mayors. And I've got lots of videos linked in here, so y'all make sure that you click on those whenever you see them. so that you get some additional information about the people and the other things that are in these notes. So, William B. Hartsfield. He was the longest serving mayor of the city of Atlanta. He served as our mayor from 1937 all the way to 1961. You know his last name for sure, Hartsfield, because the Atlanta airport is named after him now. The reason that the airport is named after him is because he was instrumental in opening the first airport in Atlanta in 1925. At the time, he was on the Atlanta City Council and was instrumental in the opening of that airport. And he's also credited with bringing air transportation to the state. He is the guy who convinced Delta to make Atlanta, Georgia, their international headquarters. So Delta is headquartered in Atlanta thanks to William B. Hartsfield. And those of you that know anything about Hartsfield Jackson International Airport know that Delta is the biggest airline operating out of that airport. And it's because we're their headquarters. They had actually moved their business to Louisiana, and Hartsfield talked them into coming back to Atlanta by explaining to them that they were building this new airport and that he would give Delta its own terminal in that airport if they would move their headquarters back to the state. So they did. So that's how Hartsfield ends up getting an airport named after him. He's also credited with tripling the size of the city of Atlanta, like pushing the boundaries out on the city. And he also expanded the expressway system. Okay, so we are finally reaching one of the good guys in Georgia history because William B. Hartsfield ends up being on the right side of history in terms of his support for civil rights, for equal rights for all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin. So he ends up coining a phrase. Remember, coining a phrase is when somebody makes up a phrase that turns into like a catchphrase for something. He's credited with coining the phrase, the city too busy to hate. And that phrase was used to describe Atlanta, saying that we did not have time for the violence and the other things that were happening in the South during the civil rights movement because we were too busy to hate. We had too much going on for that. Hartsfield promotes civil rights, and he worked really hard to keep Atlanta from erupting into that kind of racial violence that you saw in many other Southern cities during the civil rights movement. And Hartsfield is also responsible for integrating the public schools in the city of Atlanta. All right, the next or the only other mayor of Atlanta that we're going to talk about today is Ivan Allen Jr. So be sure you click on that short video to watch that about him. He takes over as mayor of Atlanta after William B. Hartsfield. So he serves as mayor of Atlanta from 62 to 70. The things that he's credited with doing for the city are improving transportation. He had Interstate 285 built. He's not in charge when it's finally finished, I don't think, but he was the person responsible for building it. He was an advocate for MARTA, Metro Atlanta Rail Transportation Authority, for those MARTA trains and MARTA buses that provide public transportation. He was an advocate for that early on. He's also responsible for bringing professional sports teams to Atlanta. So he brought the Braves in 1966. He brought the Falcons in 1966 and then the Hawks in 1968. So the Braves had actually been located, I think right before they came to us, they were in Milwaukee, and he talked them into moving that franchise here. The Falcons were actually an NFL expansion team that he brought to Atlanta. And then the Hawks, of course, come to Atlanta in 1968. And the reason that's a big deal is because these teams created thousands of jobs. Like there are jobs like working directly with the teams themselves, but then there are also jobs involved in, game day operations and making sure that the stadiums are ready to go and operational on the days of those games. And then people that come to watch those games contribute millions of dollars to our economy from ticket sales, food sales, hospitality, coming in and spending the night at hotels and going out to eat at restaurants and other taking in other entertainment. So they contribute a lot of money to the economy of the state and create a lot of jobs. Ivan Allen Jr. Woohoo! Good guy number two. It's been a minute since we've talked about somebody who also ended up being on the right side of history in terms of civil rights. Allen was an advocate for civil rights. And on his first day at City Hall, he took down all the white and colored signs that remained in the building. And he worked with Martin Luther King Jr. and other business leaders to desegregate the city of Atlanta. And when we talk about Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, in Unit 9, I'll tell you some other stories about Ivan Allen Jr. because he was actually a friend of the King family. Okay, so this is going to be the last part of the notes for today, and it is the story of the three governors controversy. Okay, so this story gets really weird and complicated, and you're just going to need to bear with me because it's ridiculous and it was super embarrassing for the state of Georgia. So here we go. All right. So this is Ellis Arnall. I would encourage you to click on this short video and watch that so you get a little more information about him. He is known as one of Georgia's major reform governors. So he came in and fixed a lot of things that were wrong in the state of Georgia. By the way, one thing I want to point out to you really quickly, take a look at this flag behind him. This flag was the state of Georgia's flag all the way up until 1956. And when we get to Unit 9, we're going to talk about how that flag has changed, why that flag was changed, and then how the flag ends up being changed again, starting in like the late 90s and the early 2000s. So just keep a mental picture, click, click, of that flag, okay? Because you're going to talk about it in Unit 9. All right, back to Ellis Arnall. So he's one of Georgia's major reform governors, made a lot of positive changes in the state. He ran against Eugene Talmadge for governor in 1942 and won. And the reason that Eugene lost that election was because he had created some big problems for Georgia's colleges and universities. And if you click here, there's a link to an article about that in New Georgia Encyclopedia. The short version is that Eugene wanted the University of Georgia to fire a professor who he had heard was promoting integration and other like positive things about civil rights. And Eugene was not down with that. Eugene did not believe in civil rights, equal rights. He was a big fan of segregation and white supremacy. So he wanted this professor to be fired. Long story long, the Board of Regents does not fire the professor, and Eugene can't do it. Like the Board of Regents is what's in charge of the colleges and universities, not the governor. But the governor is in charge of the Board of Regents. So what he does is he fires all the people in the Board of Regents that won't do what he tells them to do, and then appoints new people who will do what he tells them to do. And then he tells them to fire that professor and other professors. And he also has them like go through the libraries and get rid of books that he thought were promoting desegregation and equal rights. And so what ends up happening is Georgia's colleges and universities lose their accreditation. In other words, the governing body of the Southern colleges and the Southern Association of Colleges and Universities says we're not sure that students are really getting a quality education at Georgia's colleges and universities because of all this interference from the governor. So until that stops, we're not going to count their diplomas. It's basically what they said. And then people freaked out because, if you've been spending all your money for Bobby to go to the university to get his degree and then suddenly it's not going to count, Mama's going to be mad about that. So Eugene loses popularity over this, and Ellis Arnall runs against him, basically saying, hey, if you elect me, I'll fix that. So he got elected. While he was governor of Georgia, he abolished the poll tax. Remember, to abolish is to do away with. And the poll tax was that law that said that African Americans had to pay a tax in order to vote. And Ellis Arnall got rid of that law. He also lowered the voting age to 18. Now, check it out. See the dates here? This is when World War II is going on, right? 43 to 47. So Ellis Arnall believed if you were old enough to fight and die for your country, then you should be old enough to vote for your country's leaders. And so he lowered the voting age to 18, and other states ended up following suit and doing the same thing. So when you're 18 and you can vote, say, thank you, Ellis Arnall. He also established a teacher retirement system. Thank you, Ellis Arnall, because teachers definitely like being able to participate in the teacher retirement system. We pay into that over time. And then when we retire, we get money back from it. So it's kind of like Social Security was when we talked about the New Deal and how you pay into that by paying a tax over time. And then when you reach retirement age, you're able to take some money out of that account to support yourself. The teacher retirement system in Georgia is very similar to that. So thank you, Ellis Arnold. So here's what ends up happening to Ellis Arnold. The federal government decides that the white primary, remember the white primary was that law that said that only white people could vote in primary elections. Well, the federal government finally decided, hey, I think that might be unconstitutional. So they tell everybody they have to stop doing it. Well, in other southern states, the governors were like, yeehaw, not us, we're keeping the white primary. But Ellis Arnold, being a reform governor who had already got rid of the poll tax, clearly not a big honking racist, he says, no, it's cool. We won't do the white primary anymore. We'll cancel that. Well, when he runs for reelection, he has to run against Eugene because Eugene runs against him again for governor. And so Eugene promises the voters that if he's elected, he will bring back the white primary. And rural counties, way, way deep down in South Georgia and way, way, way up in the mountains in North Georgia, those rural counties, they want the white primary back because they still have those same beliefs. And they elect Eugene Talmadge and vote Ellis Arnold out of office. Okay. So here's where things start getting complicated. Okay. Eugene has run for governor and he has won the election, but he's not well. Eugene is sick, and his supporters, his people, were worried that he would die before he got sworn in as governor of Georgia. Okay. So here's what they did during the election to try to make sure that if Eugene died, somebody who was Eugene like would end up being the governor of Georgia. So they looked back at old Georgia laws. And they thought that based on those laws, that if Eugene died before being sworn in as governor of Georgia, that the General Assembly would get to choose a new governor. So if he died before he got sworn in, based on old Georgia law, they thought, all right, if he dies, the General Assembly is going to get to pick a governor. And they're going to look at the second place candidate and the third place candidate from the election, and they're going to choose between them. So, what they wanted to do was make sure that that second place candidate was somebody who would be just like Eugene and would do the same things that Eugene was going to do. So, they arranged for some of Eugene's supporters to do a write in instead of voting for Eugene. So, don't vote for Eugene. Instead, in the write in section of the ballot, write in the name of his son, Herman Talmadge. So Eugene supporters do this, not all of them, but some of them. They do this. And then that way, he ends up being the backup candidate. But here's where things get complicated. So the state constitution had been changed or amended to include a lieutenant governor. And it was the first time we had ever had a lieutenant governor in the history of the state of Georgia. And the new law said that if the governor died, the lieutenant governor would take over. But they didn't say anything about what would happen if the governor elect died before ever being sworn in. And so that's where things get complex. The new lieutenant governor was a man named Melvin Thompson. And Melvin Thompson was not a Talmadge kind of guy. He was anti Talmadge. He was not going to do the same things that Eugene would have done as governor. So Eugene's people, his supporters, they didn't want Melvin Thompson to become the governor of Georgia. So Eugene dies in December of 1946, just before his January swearing in ceremony. So he dies just before he's sworn in as governor of Georgia. Well, Melvin Thompson, the lieutenant governor, immediately declares himself governor of Georgia, says, I should be the governor, I'm the lieutenant governor, and I will be taking over as governor of the state. But when the General Assembly met in January, they did exactly what Eugene Talmadge's people thought they did. They went back and looked at the second and third place vote getters, and they selected Herman Talmadge to be the governor of Georgia. So now you got Melvin Thompson saying, "Oh no, well, I'm the lieutenant governor. That means I'm the governor if Eugene Talmadge dies." And then you got the General Assembly saying, "Nope, it's our job to pick somebody, and we pick Herman Talmadge." So we had this period where no one really knew who the governor of Georgia was supposed to be. Well, enter Ellis Arnold, because Ellis Arnold is technically the governor until the new governor is sworn in. And so he says, "Look, I'm not stepping down. I'm going to continue to run the state until we figure out who the real governor is supposed to be." Well, and personally, Arnold didn't think that the General Assembly had the power to do this. He thought that Melvin Thompson should be the governor. And so his plan was to stay governor until that was resolved, because he didn't feel like Herman Talmadge ought to be the new governor of Georgia, that it should be the brand new lieutenant governor. So fistfights break out amongst Talmadge supporters and Ellis Arnold supporters, and Ellis Arnold gets escorted from the building by the Georgia State Patrol. What? Exactly. Yeah, all this is going on in front of news cameras, the media, the public. It was so embarrassing for the state of Georgia. So that night, after kicking Ellis Arnold out of the state capitol building, that night, Herman Talmadge's supporters, because remember, the General Assembly says that Herman Talmadge is the governor of Georgia, they go in and they change all the locks on the governor's office. So when Ellis Arnold comes back the next day to do what he said he was going to do, to continue to run the state while they figured out who the governor was, he is locked out of the governor's office and he cannot get in. So he does what any rational human being would do. He sets up a new office. He sets up a new office in the information booth of the state capitol building. So look, here's the picture. This is Ellis Arnold and his office staff sitting down in the information booth in the main lobby of the state capitol, going about having a meeting like this is all perfectly normal. So the information booth is like the place where you would stop to ask directions if you came into the Georgia state capitol, and he's turned it into his own little temporary governor's office. The other thing that he did, because he was big mad, was he refused to give up the seal of the state of Georgia, which is this. And this is actually a stamp that the governor has, and his office stamps all of the laws and the other legal documents from the state of Georgia with the stamp. And if this seal or this stamp is not on those documents, then they are not official. So he won't give it to the new governor. He's like, "You cannot have it. I am not giving it to you." So we got him set up in the Capitol information booth carrying on meetings. He's holding the seal of the state of Georgia hostage, and Herman Talmadge and Melvin Thompson are still bickering over who ought to be the governor of the state of Georgia. So this goes on for 3 days, and Ellis Arnold realizes, the good guy that he is, Ellis Arnold realizes that this is just making Georgia look really bad, and so he steps down. But he says, I'm not Georgia's governor anymore, but Melvin Thompson ought to be," and puts all of his support behind Melvin Thompson. So at this point, the Georgia State Supreme Court gets involved, and they ruled that Melvin Thompson is going to serve as governor until a special election can be held. Remember, in Georgia, there's three types of elections. We've got general elections, primary elections, and special elections. And we talked about, when we talked about the white primary, how the primary elections are like the pre-election, when you narrow down the number of candidates from each party just to one candidate from each party. And then the general election is when those candidates from each party face off against each other. Well, special elections are exactly what they sound like. It's not a primary, it's not a regular general election, but it's a special election that's held when there's some sort of special need in the state. And Lord, this was definitely a special need, because we needed to figure out who our governor was. So they hold a special election in 1948, and y'all, don't you know, Herman Talmadge ends up beating Melvin Thompson and becomes the governor of the state of Georgia. And this is purely based on the fact that he is Eugene Talmadge's son. So, like I said, not a really good look for the state of Georgia. So here's the good news. Both Thompson and Talmadge did do some good things for Georgia. For example, Melvin Thompson, even though he was only in office for a couple of years, he ended up buying Jekyll Island for the state of Georgia. It was actually privately owned. Jekyll Island, of course, is one of our barrier islands. It was privately owned. He purchased it for the state and turned it into like a state park, state resort. Herman Talmadge ends up making improvements in education. The bad news, first of all, the three governors controversy made us look like idiots. It was in the national news, it was in the international news, and it made us look like total morons. And then the other bad news is that Herman Talmadge was a segregationist. So he continued that segregationist, racist history for our state. And then he goes on, after being governor of Georgia, to serve in the United States Senate. And he's going to come back up again in Unit 9 when we talk about the civil rights movement. Okay, so I really want you to click on this video because it is a newsreel that covers the three governors controversy. And if I remember correctly, it's like from the British news media. Like it's not even an American source. It is from the British news media. And yeah, makes us look like total bumpkins. So check that out. And thank goodness this has all been resolved and we don't have to worry about something like this happening in Georgia again. Okay, so here's the show what you know. And we kept it simple this week because you've got a lot of other things to do. So you're going to drag the tiles over, read the description, and then drag the tiles over to label them. All right, so that is it for me. And this is it for notes for Unit 8. So I will talk to you guys again when we get to Unit 9, and we're talking about the civil rights movement in Georgia. Shout out to Miss James's class if you're joining us, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.